Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Butler from Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Domestic Violence and Homelessness, What's the Connection? I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but first a few technical details. You should be able to hear me now, and through either your computer or your phone, and you should be able to see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check that your speakers are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and try to connect again. If that doesn't correct the problem, send me a message using the chat feature on the right side of the screen, and I'll try to help you once we get started. We welcome your questions as you listen to the presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. Send your question anytime during the presentation using the chat feature on the right side panel. I'll hold on to all the questions until the Q&A session, which is after the presentation. The slides you see on your screen will be emailed to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have them as a resource. Lastly, we are recording this webinar to make it available on our website as a recording, so we welcome those who may be listening to the recording. Today's webinar is one of a series of 12 sponsored by In Faith Community Foundation in 2014 as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. In Faith Community Foundation, formerly the Lutheran Community Foundation, has sponsored many previous webinars, which are archived on our website as recordings. I encourage you to check those out. Please visit infaithfound.org to read more about this series and the other great work that they're doing, and we thank them for their sponsorship. Today's presenter, Linda Olsen, is the Housing Program Coordinator with Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Her current work, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is to coordinate a Housing First pilot project for domestic violence survivors with 13 member agencies in Washington State. She has graduate degrees in theology from Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and in social work from the University of Washington. Linda has worked in the field of domestic violence for 28 years, establishing emergency shelters and transitional housing programs. Linda, thank you for being here today and sharing your expertise. Again, audience members, if you have questions, please submit them anytime using the chat box on the right side panel of the screen. Linda, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
All right, fantastic. I just needed the go-ahead that I'm coming across, and welcome everybody. It is a pleasure for me to be a part of this webinar series, and this particular webinar in particular. As Sarah mentioned, I do have deep roots in the faith communities, especially Lutheran, and also have been impassioned about domestic violence, in particular shelter and housing, for many, many years. And I know that I am undoubtedly preaching to the choir here in terms of those of you who have joined your interest in domestic violence as well as the potential housing components, and those of you who relate to the faith communities or are working within or with them. So by way of starting this, let's go to the next slide. And I am hoping that the messages that conveyed does three things. One is to make the case that domestic violence is a contributing factor in homelessness. Secondly, that we are engaged in a process of moving past shelter, and that doesn't mean eliminating emergency shelter, but moving past it in a way that can enhance the justice aspects of one's own home and maintaining that, as well as personal dignity. And finally, the role of faith communities as we work on that, I hope, together. So this particular quote is from one of my personal heroes, Anne Menard, and she is with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence in Pennsylvania. And she did this in an article about 10, 12 years ago, where she was making the case that emergency shelter is important. It's a wonderful response, but ultimately we really need to think about the ways that we as a community can support survivors access housing. And the line in particular I want to highlight is the second sentence. Without viable housing options, many battered women, particularly those already living in poverty, are forced to remain in abusive relationships. And of course, there are a couple of other also not great options there, but just remembering that there is something beyond the immediate safety and the immediate crisis response. Okay, next. So the intersection of poverty and domestic violence and the relationship to homelessness and housing stability is an important one to make. The second bullet really talks about some of the research that has been happening in the homeless world that's trying to determine the difference between people who are poor and not homeless and people who are homeless. And it's a very thin line, but pretty much what has been discovered is that people who are poor and ultimately lose their housing is that they have a thinner social network or a lack of community. Next slide. And this takes us to just the impacts of domestic violence. I've been trying to make the case to my housing and homeless counterparts for a couple of years now that domestic violence survivors, especially those on the margins struggling with income and poverty, are at risk of homelessness. One of the key indicators here is just one of the patterns of coercive control that you can see with an abusive partner, that a partner will often isolate a survivor from friends and family. Also the ostracism within a community. And just for an example, I've talked to many who are within church communities, religious communities around the country, including spouses of pastors, and have heard just the lack of belief for them if they talk about to anybody within their congregation of having experienced domestic violence if that partner is also a member of the community. So the ostracism is huge. A part of the isolation and ostracism also is the economic abuse, stripping someone of their ability to make decisions, participate in household finances, to the point sometimes of survivors who are working may not even see their check. And then finally, sabotaging any efforts made in order to secure that independence, perhaps in leaving, in terms of asserting parenting responsibilities and abilities. We certainly see the sabotage that comes in, again, as a pattern of coercive control. So, of course, as you all undoubtedly know, this is more than just physical violence. It's a number of things. Next. So it's a very complex entanglement. And one of the questions that we all continue to hear a lot is, so why doesn't the victim leave? What is the problem? And we've also heard that it takes 7 times an average of leaving. And I would propose that often one of the obstacles, although we know that there are many reasons, but one of the obstacles is that economic factors, housing, the aftermath to shelter, what happens, and just the idea for survivors that if they really do choose to flee domestic violence and leave a relationship, they very well could lose their housing and become impoverished. And the impacts on their children because of that often makes it an untenable resource or an untenable option. And even, as I point out in the final bullet here, when the abuser exits the shared housing, maybe there is a protection order that is put into place and the abuser willingly does go, the survivor may lack the resources to sustain the costs of that housing. Next. So that leads to the assertion that DV often equals homelessness for all too many survivors. And these are just a couple of highlights. There's of course a variety of research and fact sheets that that are out there, and I'm sure, again, you're familiar with the fact that the DV and sexual assault history and trauma impacts are one of the key contributors to chronic homelessness in women, that long-term homelessness because of the impacts of trauma. So that leads to just the general statistic of 92% of homeless women who experience severe physical or sexual abuse in their lives really struggle with accessing housing. And for many of you who might be working with chronically homeless populations, just seeing past that woman and realizing that there's undoubtedly a long history of physical and sexual abuse, much of it from a partner. DV is also the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And again, the statistic varies according to the sample size and where we're looking. I've seen as high as 80% as a statistic in terms of homelessness for women and children. Next. So we have all rallied over the years in order to provide that place for survivors, for victims of domestic violence to flee to. The Battered Women's Movement began as a Shelter Safe Home movement in the 1970s. And a part of that was many wonderful faith communities and faith-based organizations that did support that. But for the most part, women took other women into their own homes. There were no laws. The ostracism and shame was high. So it was a very personal network of options to be safe. And the purpose of shelter was safety. We know that domestic violence crosses all economic and social spheres, that it is not just an issue related to poverty, and that there are many, many women who have resources and are not able or don't choose to leave, don't choose to leave to go to a shelter. So safety has been kind of the primary purpose for shelter, not poverty. And so victims of domestic violence have not necessarily been seen as homeless. There's been the idea that they might choose to return to their home, or possibly with resources they would be able to find other living accommodations. Next. One of the difficulties in finding affordable housing options after a shelter stay occurred during the 1980s when there were drastic cuts to the HUD budget. The Stewart B. McKinney Act was passed in 1987 to help rectify that a little bit, but the slashes to public housing budgets, just the whole safety net that we had created, enabling us to support people who were extremely low income in housing, really was chipped away at. So survivors had a difficult time finding other places to go. So shelter stays in both DV and homeless shelters were lengthening for survivors, and they often shuffled from one shelter to another, back and forth in the DV and homeless systems. And many of you may very well might have seen this. And unfortunately, because of the obstacle in actually finding permanent housing, a lot of the blame for homelessness shifted from the system, thinking of a lack of subsidized housing and the living wages not being available, education not always being there in a way that could secure living wage jobs, more to the idea that there was a character deficiency in the homeless person. So this became a bit of a cry for social justice for those who were often working within the homeless shelter system. Next. So a part of the aftermath of shelter and trying to support those who didn't have any place to go after an emergency stay, transitional housing evolved. And this was rooted in a concept developed for those leaving institutions, whether it was mental, drug, alcohol treatment, or prison. And this was expanded upon and became part of the McKinney Act's continuum of care, which was intended to serve as a bridge between homelessness and permanent housing, so that people who had entered into homelessness would have an opportunity to fix the issues that were barriers for them in accessing permanent housing. And of course, domestic violence agencies got on board with that and were quite excited with the potential of having a place for survivors to go. I was certainly a part of that in developing a shelter or transitional housing program for those who had experienced both domestic violence and chemical dependency, because this was such an underserved population with few resources available. Next. So the continuum of care rationale was to get people ready for housing. Let's find a way that we can help folks stabilize, and just the list of everything from time away from the abuser, clean and sober time, all of those things that people might need to rectify, fix, do something about before it was seemed possible for them to be stable in housing. Okay, next. And as people struggled often with these transitional housing options, maybe they didn't comply with programs, maybe it was too hard to do whatever it was they were trying to do within the length of the time they had to do it. Sometimes they didn't like the created communities that transitional housing provided. So there were often tensions there, and sometimes they liked that community so much that they didn't understand why they had to leave at the end of 1 year or 2 years, even if they had the means to do so. So questions started being asked by the homeless housing folks about these services and activities, and could that happen in permanent housing versus in a transitional housing facility that kind of provided a created community. Next. And out of those questions, what was birthed was the whole notion of housing first. And this became very big in the late 1990s with the chronically homeless population, as well as with a number of family providers, particularly one in Los Angeles. And the whole idea was that housing is a right. It became a social justice issue, that rather than making people housing ready, it was, let's look at housing first, and let's look at what we can do to support people in a way that they can stabilize in housing and pursue the things that they need and want in the community that they choose to do that in. So the whole idea that we could look at this became something that HUD started examining and started looking at the programs doing it, and did a bunch of research related to that. And of course, HUD, in its stewardship of tax dollars, said, and it's actually a lot cheaper to do it this way versus the emergency shelter transitional housing trajectory. So next. Some of you may be asking, as many DV agencies did, that domestic violence victims just have additional barriers. So it didn't always seem like a realistic response for domestic violence survivors. And here's just a little bit of a list in terms of that barrier to housing. We haven't always dealt with this particularly well because often there's an idea or a notion that maybe we can set a time frame in terms of how long a survivor is out of the relationship. And that's kind of a false marker, because survivors can be out of relationships for years and then something might pop up with that abuser. So even in new housing, 6 months, 12 months down the road, abuse may still be an issue. And it's something that a survivor will always have to think about. She'll always be looking for community, for service providers to help support that. Sometimes the trauma impacts of domestic violence are very slow to resolve, which can also be a barrier. But homelessness in general and the trauma impacts that many homeless people face are all things that take time to resolve and make a difference with. And of course, we know in all of this, and this is another fear for survivors and Housing First, is the idea that that we might be setting them up to fail, because if they can't maintain their housing, there's a high vulnerability to return to the abuser or to another abusive relationship. Next. This is just a quick list of the issues that challenge stabilization for survivors. I've already mentioned several of them, but I want to highlight two on this list. One in particular is the isolation from social supports. I hope that by now you're hearing that as a theme throughout this presentation, that the social supports, the community, that is such an important piece of survivor healing, of the healing really for anyone, knowing that there are people, that they have chosen communities, whether that's a religious community, a neighborhood, or a cultural community. But all of those communities are so critical that any sort of destabilization usually disrupts that community. And one of the challenges that we faced in the domestic violence world is that as we try and provide frequently that secret emergency location for a survivor, we also disrupt some of those social supports in a way that prevent that family from being in touch with their community and exchanging visits back and forth. So just something to keep in mind and tuck away. And the other thing I wanted to highlight was the whole notion of pets, and how early on in my work at shelter I found out that unless I could figure out a way for pets to come to shelter, there were many survivors that simply would not do that. They would not leave their pets, and without some sort of provision that was a challenge in terms of their safety and wanting to make sure that their kids had the special parts of the household that kind of normalized it. So in this whole notion of housing first, we've certainly been finding that survivors appreciate that because of the many shelters that will not take animals or will not make other provisions for animals. Survivors find that being able to access housing quickly will help them with keeping what they consider their household intact. So just another service sort of thing to keep in mind. Next. So how can we respond? That's something that we have been exploring, and domestic violence programs for years have really been looking at restoration of survivor autonomy, of survivor choice as a really critical component. So having those specialized domestic violence informed tailored services certainly help with all of those interacting factors. And the things that we really highlight in the work that we do as domestic violence agencies is first of all self-determination. That is a key healing factor for survivors. It's a key healing factor for anybody who has experienced trauma, to have their own autonomy and choices and personal agency restored to them in a very thoughtful, supportive way. Safety. And you might be surprised that I list the second to self-determination, but again, we need to be careful that we're not moving in and taking over what we think should be safety precautions when a survivor might have something different in mind or something more to add. And then finally, just that community and social network. No matter what we do in terms of a response, we need to do our best to support that survivor either in maintaining community, or if it is not safe to do so or the ostracism is so deep, to make sure that there is a new community that that individual, the survivor, can be received into. Next. So one of our questions that I've already posed, and that again in Sarah's introduction, she mentioned that the coalition received a coordinating grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to really test Housing First for DV survivors. And in that test, we had an initial cohort of 4 agencies, just 4 willing guinea pigs who said they would try this out, and it was just very broad. Just whatever you think could work was encouraged for them to try and test and to make mistakes. That went over so well and was so creative in terms of what these agencies did that another cohort was created of 9 agencies. And we really went after those from culturally specific populations, those that are deeply marginalized. There are 3 tribal programs. There are a couple of programs targeted for Latina farm workers and a program targeted for immigrant refugees. And what we found consistently, and we'll continue on that theme with the next few slides, is the identification of both advocates and survivors, is that it's not just housing. It's truly a sense of identity. It is home. It is something that contributes to who I am and establishes that foundation of self and providing a healthy environment for one's children. Next. Next? Okay, great. So the components are to help survivors retain or access safe permanent housing, and often bypassing emergency shelters completely, and also just a very flexible approach. Half of the money for each of the organizations was really earmarked for completely flexible financial assistance for survivors, so they could choose what it was they needed help with. That might have been rental assistance, that might have been car repairs, that might have been special things for the kids, for their school activities, the sorts of things that survivors might choose between paying rent or trying to do this one thing so that their children could have more of a normal life, or that they could certainly feel secure in their home, or employment contributions so that they could continue to go to work and be employed. Next. Next. Maybe just a note in terms of the employment piece is that we found that many licensing sorts of things were often helpful for survivors to designate money to, transportation to employment, as well as some of the clothing, some of the tools that might be needed. So the DV Housing First strategies, there are 4 components. And the first one is one that absolutely surprised me as someone who's been in this field for a long time, and just really feeling that survivors needed at least a few weeks away from their home in order to sort things out, and you know, that housing retention might come later, or they might be able to return to their home. I was so surprised with how many survivors, and it was well up into 40 to 50% across the 2 cohorts, where survivors didn't leave. They were very adamant about not leaving their home. They might leave very, very temporarily for safety concerns, but it has just been astonishing how many prefer to stay in their community, keep their children in the same school. One of the most exciting example stories, I'll try to squeeze this into the timeline, was a woman who had an abuser who was at the high end of what I would say extreme lethality. And she wanted to stay in her home. She had bought this home. She was carrying a mortgage on it. It was her home. It was very close to her employment. And her preschool child had just really settled into his preschool nicely. And she had a dog, a pit bull. That was one of her security measures. So she wanted to keep this intact. And so what the agency did to help her was a very temporary motel stay while she secured the house. They put in steel doors. They put in a security system, and this is the flexible financial assistance. They did a number of things that could help her stay there that she could not have afforded. She could afford her mortgage payment. That was not an issue. She could afford all of the usual bills, but the things that made that home extra secure was not within her reach. And then finally, there was also some legal assistance in the criminal case that ensued. So these were the types of things that help somebody stay in their home. The next one is rapid rehousing, and that's quite a going term these days, and I'm sure many of you who are listening in are familiar with that, where the concept is to move someone to housing as quickly as possible. And we always do the cautionary, trying to return to this is a matter of survivor choice, of survivor autonomy, and the timing of that person. We encourage more of a progressive engagement so there aren't these time limits on emergency shelter, the 2 weeks in emergency shelter, and then you have a month to 2 months of rapid rehousing rental assistance support. So the caution is this is wonderful. It works extremely well for survivors, but again, leaving the autonomy with survivors and the choice and listening to what it is that they need. Many need subsidized housing long-term, even longer term than what transitional housing could do. And the idea of having services available is really critical. Many survivors are able to choose that housing, and having the partnerships with public housing authorities and other affordable housing providers are pretty critical. Some programs need to have that master leasing arrangement for those who are undocumented, or if there's just an extremely bad credit or criminal record history. And then some do fall under the category of having a disability that would qualify them for permanent supportive housing. All four options for a full system really need to be available. Next. So what have we learned? I think I've mentioned a lot about our learnings, but to summarize that survivor-centered, meaning that the survivor is in charge, that doesn't mean that she or often he come in with the whole idea of this is what I want to do, but a good advocate can really be patient and can listen and support that survivor in identifying what their hopes and visions and goals are. And that is the heart and soul of this particular work. The flexible temporary financial assistance is also really critical, and many of these things don't come under HUD guidelines. They're the kind of things that that come from resources, community resources, whether that's foundations, religious communities, private donors, and community partnerships. All of these partners are, again, critical in order to help people survive and move on with their lives and develop that hope in the future for themselves and their children. Next. These are a list of the challenges. I don't think I need to go into them. So next. And the successes that we've seen. The challenges, of course, were identified by the evaluation summaries, and I like to really focus on the successes because, again, we know what that would most likely look like. So restoring dignity came out as number one. That was identified consistently through our focus groups with survivors, our staff meetings, our individual interviews, and surveys done with survivors participating, was that they had their dignity back. And with that dignity and with the foundation of stable housing, they were able to focus on all of those other needs, like employment and financial skills. Those were the top two that were named, and then one of the other things that they frequently named was just the whole health and well-being, that they could pursue their health, they could pursue the health and well-being issues of their children. And then the new relationships were huge successes, especially with private landlords. And just the housing authorities. Sometimes we haven't always been that friendly with them, but they're such an important resource, and the more we can educate and strengthen those ties, the better off we are. Next. These are just some data bites in terms of the programs or the project's effectiveness. The last one is really my favorite finding, is that survivors felt safer and that they indicated that their danger levels had decreased. This didn't mean that the abuser had undergone any great, wonderful changes necessarily. Sometimes he or she had, but for the most part, survivors had their home, they felt safer, they had control over their environment. Next. The top contributions to housing retention from advocates as they worked with survivors was that a survivor was able, once stable, to find work or return to school. Ultimately being supported in their permanent housing with rental assistance for a while often helps them with that job search or to enhance their education to be better qualified for a living wage job. Advocates also said that they were able to have more time with clients and with the children. So that was an enhancement in terms of housing retention and really contributed to people being able to stay. And just knowing that the agency services were there in case survivors might need it. Sometimes survivors could be humming along for a couple of months doing just fine, and folks felt, oh, we can exit them from the program, and then there might not be that child support payment, or they might be laid off, or seasonal work could go away, and their housing once again was in jeopardy, and it was nice to be able to return to the agency services for additional support. Next. According to survivors, what they said worked were the advocates. Universally, every single one of them, even those that were not always happy with what the advocates did or didn't do, said that was the difference, and especially advocates who were non-judgmental, which I believe every single one of this crew that we were working with certainly are great examples of that. And then the second, being rooted in community. This became a theme for survivors as well as for advocates, that just having that stable, wonderful community, a household in a community that was a neighborhood they felt comfortable with, and having those community factors that they could reach out to. And housing of their choice that wasn't just safe from the abusive partner, but also in a safe environment that they identified. And sometimes that can be challenging with affordable housing. But survivors frequently could figure out ways to kind of support the safety of that environment. Some talked about being close to a police station, or maybe close to a religious community, or close to good neighbors that they trusted. So the safe housing that wasn't in a neighborhood where they felt that they couldn't come home from a late night job and be safe. The stability, the whole sense of healing, restoration of dignity, hope, keeping and getting their job and going to school, and then finally culturally specific services. As you may recall, I mentioned that we really went after culturally specific programs to test this, and it was confirmed by survivors that while domestic violence services in general are often very helpful, there is something special about working with an advocate who is familiar with that culture, maybe a part of that culture, and can respond to them in a way that is thoughtful and respectful. Next. Things weren't that much different in terms of how well it worked when we talked to advocates and directors. Again, the community, the agency in the community made a huge difference. Survivor-centered advocacy, just that whole idea again of the mobility to go to where a survivor might be at his or her choice, And you know, this flies often in the face of what we've done traditionally in asking survivors to come to us, particularly in urban areas. But our rural counterparts just really showed us the way that when you're looking at these rural areas where there is not transportation, where survivors aren't easily able to get into a community where there might be an office or a shelter, that for that advocate to travel to them is huge. And then finally, just the overall flexibility of the advocacy and of the financial assistance was extremely helpful. Next. Again, a wonderful testament to how it changes, how DV Housing First changes the lives of survivors and their children. Next. And I can't say it enough. If you didn't catch the message, it's really all about the community. All about the community for that resiliency, for the healing, and for the connection to resources and relationships, and vital for safety. Next. So I think the question to think about now is, how can your congregation be that community? And I know that congregations around the country have been wonderful in terms of their support for emergency services. I don't know what homeless and domestic violence shelters would do without you. It's been so critical and so important. But thinking about what are some additional things that can be considered. And I think the first thing is just remembering that you probably have DV survivors in your congregation. When you think of the whole idea of 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence, none of our communities, congregations have escaped from that. I know that every congregation my husband has served, congregations that we have participated in, there have been domestic violence victims in those congregations. So being mindful of that as you create your own welcoming, safe, supportive environment for your members. And incorporating the fact that these issues exist and that your congregation is a place where it can be discussed, that it can be brought out into the open, not individual situations, that there's the privacy and confidentiality for that, but as a topic, take a stand, name it. It's so important. Having resources available. I'm always tickled when I go into a church bathroom, restroom, and see the stickers or the brochures of numbers to call. Be familiar with your local domestic violence program and have the relationship with them that if you do have a survivor in your congregation, there could be some work alongside that DV program as is appropriate and as the survivor might choose. Foster opportunities for safe conversations. And as I mentioned about flexible financial assistance, if there is a way to discreetly make available the same financial resources to a survivor in your congregation that you might to an outsider, please try and do that. Next. And maybe going back to the term I used as far as outsider, making sure that we all minister to the broader community as our own congregation is warm and welcoming and healing and observant of the issues of violence and putting out there that we really support healthy relationships and what that looks like. That attracts people in the broader community. People want to be a part of that sort of environment. And think about extending or expanding your congregational support beyond residential programs. Again, it's critical. Don't abandon them if that's what you've been doing. But think about the empowering components of flexible financial assistance to a vendor and gift cards so that survivors can feel like they're in charge of their lives and they're providing for themselves and their families. And think about your membership. I think it is just really important to remember that there are many landlords, private landlords within congregations that could be helpful. Car mechanics other people willing to share skills, the things that could be a supportive environment and useful too, exist. Think about it. Next. And so where do you start? What are you doing now? What are your congregation's strengths? And how can you best apply those strengths, which I already mentioned a bit of a list of how you could think about your individual membership and what you all can be doing together. And what do you need in your little inventory as far as education and support from community organizations and experts? And of course, where you are tuned in right now is a wonderful expert, Faith Trust Institute. And as you access your other community organizations and experts, develop your plan and launch. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, and many of you have done that, are doing that, but I encourage just to expand and think outside the box. Next. And finally, the resource page, and I would just highlight a couple on here. Our state coalition, the WSCADV website is a wonderful place to learn more about domestic violence, Housing First. We also have toolkit available, many publications, evaluation summaries, so that you can take a look at what we've done and adapt as might be useful. The next one, the Institute on DV and the African American Community, I think is just a great resource, particularly for communities that knowingly have both survivors and their abusive partners in their congregations. And this can help explore the ways that healing can happen for a culturally specific community within a faith community. And I think those were the two I wanted to highlight. Sarah, it's yours.
Thank you, Linda. So we have a few minutes for questions. Audience members, you can submit your questions through the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. I have a couple of questions here. Linda, you mentioned at one point that self-determination was a key component, and you actually listed it above safety concerns, and I'm wondering if that's an evolution in thought.
It definitely is, Sarah. We have always, in the domestic violence field, put safety at the top, and I think we've done an excellent job with that. However, one of the things that has happened with the safety frameworks that we use is that it can take away the autonomy and choice of a survivor. And as we back away from that and rethink that, we are realizing that the safety has to be a partnership. We have to respect the survivor's choices, as difficult sometimes as they may be. And sometimes we need to realize that we don't know the full picture. We may only see a sliver of her reality. And trying to safety plan around a sliver might eliminate some really critical components to what we're doing. So yeah, we're shifting. And again, that is new, that's cutting edge. And it's spreading slowly, but is definitely here in Washington State.
Great. Several times through the presentation, you talked about partnerships with faith communities, working with domestic violence advocates and programs, housing programs. I wonder if you have any examples of things that you think are really great, that have done something innovative.
Wow, there are so many. I think just the organization that I used to be a part of, LifeWire, they have, they're in East King County, and they've actively worked with congregations to move them away from some of the traditional emergency shelter supports to doing more of the gift cards, doing more of those donations that are specific to a family, and trying to create the ways that are empowering for a survivor to make choices in her own life and within her household. I think some other really wonderful, at the other end of the spectrum, creative ways have been, again, and this is more of the Lutheran network, and I know that we're not the only ones, but Lutheran or Compass Housing Alliance has really worked with congregations in housing development. So there are a couple of Lutheran congregations in the King County area that have totally redone their sanctuaries, their buildings, or donated their buildings, done other things with their specific worshiping community, so that affordable low-income housing could be created. And I know that there is one project right now that will be targeted to vulnerable families, which will include a huge population of survivors of domestic violence. So there's a whole spectrum of very small to very big, and it's all good, all wonderful, whatever a congregation is able to do and interested in doing.
Wonderful. Are there other states where there is a Housing First program in action or in thought for domestic violence survivors?
Portland, Oregon, the Volunteers of America, which is a faith-based organization, has their Home Free program, and that one was really the first domestic violence Housing First program that was started, and it is just a great resource. That's home free. Washington, D.C. has a program called DASH, and I don't remember what those initials stand for. You could Google it, Washington, D.C. DASH, and they also focus on access to housing. Iowa, the state of Iowa, is looking at its whole internal structure of emergency shelter and services and moving to domestic violence Housing First options. And I am sure that there are many others in different places. I see smatterings of a program here and there in Missouri and in New York, and we've got a lot of interest in other states to do this sort of work with domestic violence survivors and housing. And of course, my question on the local level is, and what is your interaction with your faith communities, with your congregations? And I'm still trying to figure that out nationally. I'm not sure how extensive the connection is with Home Free and some of their faith communities, but I can imagine that it would certainly be a big part.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we're out of time for questions. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I think the primary final thought is just to reinforce the amazing work that committed communities of faith do together, and that with some creativity and presence in the community, that thinking of outside the box can lead to so many more wonderful opportunities for dignity, for hope, both for survivors within congregations and within the greater community. And I'm excited to continue to watch what you all do. And thank you for this opportunity, Sarah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Linda. Before we end today, just a couple of notes. For those of you in the Pacific Northwest, In Faith Community Foundation is sponsoring Safe and Healthy Churches training, Ending Family Violence, in Seattle in October. The application deadline is August 15th, so please visit faithtrustinstitute.org for more information. And we want to thank you for joining us today. Linda, it was wonderful to talk with you. And thank you to the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring the webinar. I'll email the presentation slides to all of you this afternoon. When you close the webinar window in a few moments, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. So please take a moment to give us your feedback about the webinar and any ideas or suggestions you have for future webinars. You can view all of the upcoming webinars online at faithtrustinstitute.org. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Linda?